Panel number 2 is looking at, the topic is Beyond Neoliberalism and the Prospects for an Pan-African Economics. The first professor I'd like to call up is Joseph Assan. Joseph Assan is an assistant professor at the International Political Economy of Sustainable Development at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. Thank you very much. Following Dr. Assan is Dr. Heidi Gengenbach, here from UMass Boston. Dr. Heidi joined the history department at the University of Massachusetts in 2013, and she has over a decade of research, teaching, and consulting in the field of African agricultural livelihoods and gender history. Next, I'd like to call up Dr. Patricia Agupusi. Patricia Agupusi is a political economy scholar with a background in philosophy, international law, and economics. Next, Dr. Kwamina Panford. He's an associate professor of culture, society, and global studies at Northeastern University. And last, our own Dr. Adugna Lemi. Adugna Lemi is associate professor and chair of the Department of Economics here at University of Massachusetts in Boston. Let's have a round of applause for our next panel. Thank you very much.
All right.
Wow, the lights are so bright.
Is it too bright? It's because that's the...
You video light. Working so hard.
Video
I get you
light.
another water or a cup of coffee or something? You'll take care of it yourself. Yeah, that's fine.
Are you doing the same?
Yes.
I'm on it.
But I knew you from UK.
You've already had
All right, we'll start by asking each of you the same question, the same first question that we asked the previous panel. Our panelists are getting to know each other up here. Okay, so we'd like you to just give us 1 minute in introducing yourselves by way of your research, teaching, programming in Africa, of Africa, vis-a-vis Pan-Africa Rising. And I'll start with Adugna.
Hello, everyone. My name is Adugna Lemi. I'm from the Department of Economics here at UMass Boston. I teach courses in political economy of African countries. I do research on Africa, China in general, and the whole continent. In terms of my activities with African countries, I have been working with ARC. I don't know how many of you know ARC. It's African Economic Research Consortium that's based in Nairobi that provide training, research. This is probably my 6 or 7 years working with them, helping them train PhD students from a lot of African countries. I bring them to Nairobi for a summer workshop and so on. That's where I do most of my work. And I also did my undergraduate in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa University, and I work with them too. I'm also part of the IGERT program here at UMass Boston, where we have PhD students from here, take them to African countries for a visit to see how the problems compare, mostly environmental problems. And that's it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Kwamina.
Hi, I'm Kwamina Panford. I teach at Northeastern University. I dabble in 3 basic areas: labor, workers' organizations. I also look at international organizations with emphasis on WTO, ILO, and of course the OAU, African Union. I was actually present when the African Union was born. The African Union was born in Durban, South Africa. And since 2009, I've been writing oil and gas laws as a way of overcoming what most people will refer to as the natural resource curse. Although I spent a bit of time in the United States the way I was trained in my discipline, it always means that you have to be on the site to observe things for yourself, to distinguish between things you've seen with your eyes, preferably without glasses, things that you have read, and things that you're very convinced in. With respect to this panel, one of the things I have done is to interview individuals who worked very closely with Kwame Nkrumah, including the gentleman who actually invited Kwame Nkrumah to join him in Ghana to lead the liberation movement. Thank you.
Thank you. Patricia.
Thank you very much. My name is Patricia Agupusi. I'm currently a visiting scholar at Brown. So my work is in political economy, mostly comparative political economy. I teach both political economy, international relations, and African politics. I have two major projects I'm working on now. One is on domestic terrorism, focusing primarily on Nigeria, but also expanding to other parts of Africa like Kenya in the East. And also, I'm also working currently on an issue of political economy of South Africa, looking at the two economies, what Mbeki called the two economies, one poor, one rich, one developed, one underdeveloped. So I'm looking at this within the state capacity approach and also the politics that goes on in terms of the state capture in South Africa. So recently I just got back from Nigeria and looking at Boko Haram, which is also part of the domestic terrorism I'm looking at. And for this panel, of course I'm glad to be here, and I'm gonna see what the questions that will be coming, and I guess it's also within the area I'm working on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia. Joe.
Hello, my name is Joseph Assan. I'm a professor at Brandeis University at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management. My particular interest in terms of research is within the area of international political economy. I'm a development studies specialist by training, political economy by choice. With regards to my research or scholarly work, my most recent work has focused on internal migration, looking at internal migration of youth within the West African region by using case studies in Ghana and trying to understand the stepwise migration of young people as they move from different parts of the country to the most prominent locations within a country where employment is perceived to be more available. And then I'll look at a comparative analysis of young migrants who move from one location to the other in comparison with their local nascent colleagues who probably didn't move, and then trying to understand some of the policy and welfare implications of internal migration. I teach various courses, including topics relating to poverty reduction, issues relating to conditional cash transfers, and in particular, project management aspects, which I am fan of. So I teach those courses as a way of helping and preparing our students to become employable, since I'm looking at migration employment, and then making sure that they can get all the very good jobs that are out there. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Heidi.
Hello, I'm Heidi Gengenbach. I'm on the faculty here in the history department. Thanks so much for organizing this day. I'm so excited, our first Africa Day here. Right, so I'm a historian. I've been working as a historian doing research mostly in Mozambique since 1992, which makes me feel very elderly. I teach courses here at the university, though, that cover the continent. I teach a couple of African history survey courses. I also teach African food history, women and gender in African history, a couple of courses on food and empire, which I squeeze Africa into every chance I get. And let's see, my own research has changed over the years. I've taught as a historian for several years and then took some time off from being an academic and worked as a consultant with the Global Fund for Women and on a couple of other research projects that focused on contemporary poverty policy and rural livelihoods in Africa. Currently, excuse me, my research, I have two research projects going on right now. One is very historical. I'm looking at a 500-year history of hunger and anti-hunger interventions in a very small place in central Mozambique. And then I'm also working on a very different project in another part of Mozambique with a team of researchers, and we are following the dietary and nutritional impacts of an agricultural development program that started a couple of years ago and is ongoing and is very controversial. And my work has always focused on rural women, and from the start as a historian, having found early on that rural African women don't get much representation in historical archives, let alone in historical scholarship, I've had to really do a lot of anthropological type fieldwork, a lot of oral history, a lot of working with women's knowledge among women who don't have access to writing, who are often marginalized in policymaking. So I continue to have that focus on women and gender, and especially on rural development initiatives, at the same time as I believe that a very deep historical perspective and the specifics of place are important to understanding some of the policy issues that Africa, or the challenges that Africa faces now.
Thank you all. And so our first question actually begins where our last panel left off, although it asks the question a bit differently, given that this is a panel that focuses on political economy, beyond neoliberalism, I believe, and the title is Beyond Neoliberalism and Prospects for a Pan-African Economy. And so this question, which was our question number 3, does the concept of Pan-African economics direct a viable alternative route for African prosperity? That is the question.
Okay, I would like to begin, and instead of addressing rhetorical issues and engaging in a lot more theory, what I'm going to do with respect to my answers is to address practical issues that can be applied in this particular context. I've been dealing with oil and gas production in many African countries, the same with diamond, gold, and other expensive but sold very cheaply. To my mind, one of the simplest things that can be done is, and I picked this from a common tenant-landlord lease agreement. You go to the internet, you go to Staples, you pick up a standard sheet that writes out how much deposit you have to pay for a month, security deposit, and do. Africa needs to move in that direction, which is gold, diamond, oil, and everything. Because if it happened, Ghana was trying to charge more royalties for gold, and the gold company said, we'll move to Tanzania. You cannot move to Tanzania, engage in what is called race to the bottom, if all African countries, or the majority, agree that this is the bottom line. The Commonwealth Secretariat gave Ghana 12.5% as the least royalty for oil and gas. Ghana did 3, Ghana did 5. So there's a lot of room for growth for Pan-Africanism, trying to standardize and harmonize these kinds of processes.
Thank you. Anyone else? Patricia.
Well, I have done some work on issue of Pan-Africanism, which of course I drew from your book. And one of the things I find out, especially relating African Union, which also the foundational ideology is Pan-Africanism, is the unity that they claim to have. But like he says, it's not about just the rhetoric, but also the practical thing that happened in the region. One thing I find out speaking with people and also around the research is that Pan-Africanism is actually a way to go, given that we need that global integration. But in reality, it has not been happening. For instance, now we have this ECOWAS that is going on, but there's no network. It's part of the unity on a regional level. There's no network. And now when we talk about Pan-Africanism, what about the indigeneity that is also integrated into it? Because it's also about Africans doing things by themselves. Someone asked the question about dependency. We know that Africans have also internalized dependencies because they also depend on external finance and external ideas. So in as much as Pan-Africanism is the way to go, but what are African people doing about it? One thing I found out is that Africans as individuals are interested and also actually believe and work towards Pan-Africanism. But the leaders have not done that in as much as they are the ones that pursue, and you hear this rhetoric more from them. So I think if you go by probably also in addition to what you say in your book, looking at individual countries in context, like Harambee context philosophy in Kenya, the Afro-capitalism in Nigeria, the Mbuti in, say, South Africa. If we can integrate this African philosophy in our political and economic development, which is all Pan-Africanism is saying, then you see that Africa could move forward as an individual country and also as a region and a continent collectively.
Thank you. Anything else? Joe?
So I have in the past, or in recent past, struggled with this notion of Pan-Africanism for various reasons. Whilst I believe it's an essential concept, I'm using the word essential because of the values and the benefits that one could derive from. In the context of pragmatic policy and practical, observation, I'm not very sure whether the continent, as regards countries and our citizens, are ready for that concept. As you mentioned earlier, Kwame Nkrumah was a very strong proponent of Pan-Africanism, as well as others during their time. And growing up in Ghana, we were brought up in a Pan-African context. So in my high school days, for example, I believe Kwamina had a similar experience. You see students from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Angola. We grew up with students from almost all over the continent. I believe some of you may have had similar experiences. And so seeing other Africans or working with other Africans for me was natural and normal. And in Ghana, we were inculcated, that was inculcated into our education system and expectation. And so, but then if you look at in practice with regards to policy and processes, I find it very sad to say that several parts of the continent are not ready for that kind of notion. For one example, I would say, for example, look at what is happening in our governance system. Several African countries, unfortunately, in the 70s and 80s, had military dictatorships, which ran our economies down. Unfortunately, we decided to move towards civilian rule and democratic dispensation with decentralized governance or systems of governance, which allows citizens' participation in our governmental systems, which is great. Then we came up with constitutions that will govern our decentralized governance systems, and then suddenly we have this wave of constitutions being changed from one term to presidents, the term of office now. You go to East Africa, it's become like a new hobby. Every country is now looking at how to change the terms of the presidents. I said, well, that is ridiculous, right? And no other president is standing up to question that behavior because they are also considering what they can do in their own backyard, probably, how they can also tweak their own constitution. But I wouldn't take that as Pan-Africanism, because that is not what Pan-Africanism is supposed to be. Yeah. But who is questioning that Pan-African behavior, or that's this new notion? You have it in Rwanda, you have it in Uganda, so is that the wave of Pan-Africanism we're talking about? Because that is going to take us backwards. Yep. You see? So this is the debate that I have. What is the standard of our Pan-Africanness? What is the norm of our Pan-African? Sure. What are the norms of Pan-Africanism, and how will this shape our collective future if that is supposed to be a future that we should be envisaging? Thank you.
Heidi, anything? Adugna? Oh, Heidi, go ahead.
Go ahead. Please. Go ahead. I just want to go a little bit deeper from the last speaker and asking the question of why we need the Pan-Africanism in the first place. Is it political or is it economic? What kind of calculation we are making? Previous panels discussed about some gains from Pan-Africanism. If countries get together, they have more bargaining power, they can negotiate better, they can make influence in the global discussion or in global tables. That's fine, that's for bargaining power. If you go a little bit further and talk about, is there any viability? I think the question is about economic viability.
Yep.
So the question about economic viability is we have to see countries, if they come together, then what do they do? What is the trade flow between African countries? To what extent African countries are integrated? The answer is very little. It has been improving a little bit, but The reason why these countries are not well integrated is, one, there is no infrastructure. It is cheaper to call from Kenya to US than to call from Kenya to Ethiopia. That happened to me myself, so I know that.
Yep.
There's no infrastructure. Second is what kind of things they produce. My friend here mentioned about, they should focus on oil or minerals. Nobody is buying oil or minerals from each other within African countries. They have to export it out. Mm-hmm. So their major partners are countries outside of Africa. So forming Pan-Africanism just for trade purposes, for economic purposes right now is not viable. What's happening in the last 10, maybe 15 years in African countries is slightly to shift our trading partners from the West to China. That's, in economic terms, that's what's happening. Within African countries, there are a lot of regional organizations formed, COMESA, ECOWAS, SACU, SADC, a lot of this. Their trade flow within these countries, for example, within these regional integrations, if you take, for example, COMESA, is very little, because these countries produce basically the same thing, and they can't increase trade more than that. If you are talking about regionalism, to form a group like West African countries, Eastern African countries, if they are producing the same to bring their bargaining power up, like in West African countries for cocoa export, that's good. But to bring all the countries together economic-wise, to think of something like Europe at this time, I support where my friend stands in terms of economic viability. I would say it is not there yet. But politically, for bargaining powers and for making negotiation, that's possible.
Thank you. Heidi, anything on food security and Pan-Africanism?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I can add. Everyone's answered so thoughtfully. And I guess my response is much like the latter two. I'm glad you brought up the issue of infrastructure, and the sort of the colonial legacy that has produced that infrastructure. And as somebody who works on Mozambique, which is in so many ways just not part of the discussions about Africa as a whole, and with the other Lusophone former Portuguese colonies. And there's a way in which my friends and colleagues in Mozambique, their concern is not so much about Pan-Africanism as about what is their relationship with the Portuguese-speaking world, including Brazil in particular. So they're just different priorities. And I think in terms of defining regional economic strategies, I love the idea of standardizing the suggestion that was made, and the idea of mobilizing and for a kind of political solidarity and being in a position of negotiating strength with China, with the US, with Europe, with outside investors. But there is always this question of who decides the priorities, and because of the people that I work with, and in a country where the average rate of chronic malnutrition is 45%, nearly half the population, the question of Pan-Africanism is a little bit of a luxury for many of the people who live outside of cities, one of the people on the previous panel made the very correct observation that many young people in Africa are hooked into the internet and have cell phones. Well, there are a lot of people in Africa who aren't, and who don't have access to this sort of world of ideas and policy. And I've found that priorities can be very different when you're in these particular places experiencing particular infrastructural disadvantages and their own particular experience of export agriculture or natural resource management of one kind or another. So I'm torn. I feel like Mozambique, it's not in a place I think for many reasons, it's democratic in theory, and in practice there are a lot of problems and a lot of political challenges to the government. So yeah, I think I would always argue in favor of, what are the priorities that people themselves are defining, and how do we listen to those rather than...
Quickly, since this is a back and forth.
Very quick. I think maybe my point was misinterpreted or not understood. What do landlords in the Boston area have in common? They are not necessarily teaming up to work together. They've come up with a standard form for leasing out apartments. All that I'm saying is that we in Africa should look at how we can replicate a similar system. If you're coming to drill gold in Nigeria or Ghana or Uganda or whatever it is, we have a form that says 5% royalty or nothing. It has nothing to do with amongst African trade. For those skeptics amongst us with respect to African unity, was it in 1993 or 1999, when the African Union, the OAU, told Nigeria that if it did not revert to a civilian regime, it was going to be punished.
Yeah.
So there are all these, unfortunately, at times, maybe because of what we're doing, we don't like to look at the history and what is going on in some of these problems, in some of these
And
places.
to what
That's one of
extent
the
can, on the economic and African integration help very poor, countries like Mozambique, Niger, which are sort of landlocked, and one of the reasons why they suffer from insecurity, but they are sort of bounded by unnatural boundaries. And so to what extent can integration of the economy, sort of loosen up that, grip hole and foster or facilitate intra-African trade in goods and resources to the extent that it can help countries like Mozambique, might be the question.
Oh, well, in terms of integration, a lot of evidence and research has been done on that. Most African countries do not actually trade with one another.
They don't.
So interregional trading is very low. African countries, like Heidi said, tend to trade with their former colonies.
Right.
And because of that, there has been less development, whether it's
Right.
in infrastructure, especially road network. And also, globally, African trade is very low, like 3%. So there is a huge evidence, research has been showing. For instance, Hausman of Harvard has done some research in the area. A lot of people have done research in the area. Integration will help Africa more than anything, especially not just integration, African integration with one another and trading with one another.
Yeah.
So whether that will help is not a question that we need to ask, but how could that happen? Because there's all the evidence that shows that it's one of the ways that Africa can grow, not just grow in terms of GDP, but diversify more and help lift up other small African countries.
But how and why isn't it happening? Okay, I have another question from the audience, and this is about, I know many of you have heard about the African adage that where do you get the coltan in your cell phones? Have you guys heard that? Where do you get the coltan in your cell phones? 70% of your cell phones are driven by a mineral, a resource called coltan. Where does it come from? It comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And yet, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is one of the poorest countries in the world. And so this question says, why is Africa resource rich and income poor? And what can be done about it?
1923 or so, Harvey Firestone went to Liberia, leased 100 acres of land for 6 cents per acre. Fast forward to 2005, under Charles Taylor, Firestone and the Liberian government renegotiated the deal for 50 cents. Prior to that, Liberia had borrowed money from the US government at the rate of 17%, from Harvey Firestone to Liberia, 17%. The harbor was used for latex, L-A-T-E-X, export, and was also used by the US Army and Navy. And Liberians got stuck with a 17% interest rate. This is precisely the point that I'm making. If at that time there were other African countries who could have worked with Liberia to say that you're not coming here to lease land for 6 cents an acre, Harvey Firestone may have been forced to deal with Liberia or move out of Africa. A lot of us here are very proud of Ghana. Guess what? Ghana has some of the worst oil and gas deals in the world. Natural gas, 3%. Crude oil, 5%. This is precisely the point that I wish to stress. If African countries were getting together and checking out how much they're getting, they could have done something about the 3-5%, bumped it up a little bit. By the way, that's step number one. So I'll keep quiet.
Okay, Adugna?
Yeah. I see two issues why Africa has all these resources but still poor. And the first issue is previous panel discussed about agency.
Yeah.
I went to a forum in China, Beijing Forum 2018, last year. And they mentioned only 2 countries in Africa with agency. It's South Africa and Ethiopia. All the other countries, the representatives are not representing the people. So that's a big problem. Right? As a result, this takes me to the next problem why Africa has these resources and still poor, is access to technology and capital. Who else is coming to dig these minerals out? There are all these companies from the West. The only reason is because they have capital and they have technology, right? So the question is, then why don't we have capital or technology? This brings us back to the first issue I raised, which is agency. You can't just get capital or technology right overnight. So it has to come with somebody responsible, representing the people, try to think about how to get it for a long term, not just for a short term when they win election and then disappear. So these two issues of lack of agency and access to these key resources, in addition to the natural resources that you need to basically prosper. One way to go about it is to try to do it like the China way. You know all the story about the back and forth between US and China. The China way is get the technology or bring the companies into your country, force them to share the technology and then copy that technology to do your own company. I don't think we are there yet. That until we do that and until we get our own agency, we'll still think about what happened to us, why we are poor.
Thank you. Patricia?
Thank you. I agree completely to what you said, so I'm not going to repeat this. So agency is very important. I think in my class I always emphasize African agency. And then another thing is this. When we talk about African agency, who do we actually mean? When I was growing up, I'm from Nigeria. When I was growing up in Nigeria, we just finished secondary school. We have some young, older ones that also have finished their studies. They want to manufacture new things. They have ideas, they can do it, but there was no capital. It's not just there was no capital, but also there's no mechanism for any incentive to help young people to rise or be able to achieve their potentials. These are part of where countries innovate, right? So what you find out here is that in most of these countries, there is no institution, there's no mechanism around on the ground to support innovation. Now, I'm moving away a little bit from agency. And why do we have that? Is because most African leaders are not actually interested in building the country, more of amassing power consolidation and wealth. I'm not now talking about just the corruption, but most of this money goes out. So you said there's no capital. We have capital, it's just that it is, we have capital outflow, mostly from our leaders. So when we say agency, we mean the leaders. The people themselves, the African people, are ready to work, and they're quite innovative, but there's no institution, in the right institution there. Some of these people, young people then that I was talking about, has to migrate to Europe because they need to have some capital. Some of them has come back, some refuse to come back. So one will say, why is Africa so rich but also very poor? Apart from agency, there's institution that is going on. But also there's external factor. We cannot really rule that out. But because we have been in a position whereby Africa is like a place that is all, left in this cage, and also everything is operated and implemented and controlled by the external power. Our leaders tend to internalize that if something is not coming from the outside, it's not good enough. So because of this, they are not accountable to their own citizen. For instance, the AU or NEPAD framework was first endorsed by the G8 before it was even brought into the African continent. So these are the problems. Is an interaction between external and internal factor. And when you mean, these factors also have to do with the way our agencies, our leaders, have been able to neglect their role as leaders, but instead pay more attention in getting endorsement from outside.
Okay. Thank you. Joe? Okay.
Right. So this concept of poverty, increasing poverty in spite of our unfathomable wealth, is another paradox that makes us debate the Pan-Africanism and where that should go or how that should go. I will bring it to the concept of youth, for example. Africa has the poorest youth in the world. We have the poorest youth. So when you talk about resource, even in the human resource sense, we are still the poorest. And we can't blame the US or the West or any other regional powers for making our youth poor, because we don't have systems in place to ensure that our human resource capacity is being enhanced and developed or cultivated over time. According to the International Labour Organization, the average poverty across the continent is about 35%, and then of this 35%, poor individuals classified as poor, 23.5% are youth or individuals within the youthful category. So, and these are what we call working poor. So these are not individuals who are unemployed; they are employed but poor. So if you see the irony of the matter, we talk about increasing explosive youthful population, who, fortunately, for those who even get into the employment sector, are still classified as poor because of either low wages or low income or involved in underemployment or work which will be technically considered indecent work. So I'm trying to highlight the fact that beyond our natural resources, as Kwamina is saying, which is unfortunately not under appropriate terms, so we are not generating the appropriate revenue, our human resource itself is also unfortunately poor. And I'm not saying this to be pessimistic or paint a negative picture. I'm trying to highlight the fact that so we have work to do even in the context of this human resource, which will then help us even govern these resources that we are talking about.
Thinking about how to develop our human resources
So
through education and employment opportunities. Right. Okay. Heidi.
As a historian, I could talk forever in answer to this particular question, so I almost feel like I shouldn't start. But I love that you started with the example of Liberia and the rubber, because what I worry about is as a historian, and I know this will come across as not realistic, but I think accepting the legacy of kind of colonial restructuring or undermining of African economic possibilities by deciding which cash crops would be prioritized, deciding which minerals would be focused on, the decisions are still being made outside. So I was really glad, Patricia, that the point that you made about the external factor in all of this. And to give you an example, the project I'm working on, this development project, is focused on a crop called cassava, which is about the least sexy thing you can talk about when you're talking about agricultural development. It's a sort of mundane root crop that people refer to as, sort of poor man's crop. It happens to be the food staple of a large portion of the African continent, sure. And where this one project I'm doing, foreign investors, South African, Mozambican, government partnerships have been formed in order to transform cassava in it's actually two different parts of the country, from a subsistence crop into a cash crop. Why? because the beer company, this is the South African SAB Miller, some of you
Sure.
might know, the beer company decided a few years ago that they thought it would be that there was a big portion of the potential African beer drinking market that hadn't yet been captured. The poor, sort of underpaid working folks who would like to drink bottled beer instead of homebrewed beer, but couldn't afford to do it. And so SAB Miller decided, with the help of a Dutch company, developed a technology that enabled them to process cassava bought from very poor farmers and turn it into manufactured beer. And they produced the very first commercial cassava-based beer in the world. It's called Impala. This all looks very wonderful. It's taking advantage of a resource that's produced in great abundance in many parts of Mozambique. It was targeting very poor farmers. This is a female-dominated crop. The response, the kind of blueprint development approach that was imposed on these sort of communities of farmers, which was only taking into account how do we take advantage or how do we profit from something that exists already, a structure that South Africa's dominance over Mozambique's economy goes back a century and a half. There was no consultation of the farmers, of the women. The effect of this project has been, one, it's struggled and has been quite disastrous in some communities, and in other areas, it has dramatically exacerbated the gap between rich and poor farmers because only rich farmers are able to take advantage of it. So this was an outside designed program that is very colonial in its conception, that doesn't challenge this assumption that sort of outsiders and policymakers know what's best for this community. And it's having very detrimental effects at household levels in terms of access to cash income and people's diets and vulnerability now that people are under pressure to sell their cassava instead of eating it. So it just, as an example of something that seems very kind of outside the discussions of oil exploitation and you know, Mozambique has rubies and natural gas, but there are large populations of very untapped people who have enormous energy, who respond to these initiatives with like such optimism as you're talking about with you. This is a great chance. And then because their voices and their knowledge weren't taken into account, they're disastrous.
Sure. I have a good one for you. It's general, but let me see how each of you might bring your own spin on it. So, where do you stand on the China in Africa debate? Neo-colonialism or free trade? China in Africa.
Okay, maybe I should start. I have 2 papers now working on China in Africa, and where do I stand? You know, I'm just tired of blaming others for the problem of Africa. Like you said earlier on, it's about the agency of Africa. And pardon? Oh, okay. So I say that I'm tired of blaming outsiders because now in the previous panel, the question was about the way Africa is treated by the West. How about the way we Africans don't own our own agency? So in regard to China in Africa, I had I went to Nigeria, I did interview some private sectors. And the problem is this, the private sectors actually negotiate their way better in Nigeria, for instance, than the government do. So whether it's new colonialism or anything you call it, it's about, I don't want to call it that because it doesn't help us in any way. I think we need to hold our leaders, the people negotiating this economic trade or investment responsible. So we're not like 50 years ago where we didn't know what is going on. They've had the experience of the West in Africa, colonization and other things. So it is time African leaders learn to negotiate. China comes to Africa, they do this bilateral thing. They come and give us the news that they're going to give Africa $60 billion. We don't know how much goes there. However, when they want to deal with Africans, they deal with Africans bilaterally. Why is that? Because they know that doing it by slide helps them a lot. But Africans tend to sell themselves away. So the question we'll be asking is this: how do we get African leaders, the people that make this negotiation, think more about the benefit of African rather than what goes into their pocket. So it's not just in terms of China, or it also pertains to other countries. So whether it's neo-colonization means that we are also seeing ourselves as people or group of people that don't have agency.
Okay, I will add to the Africa and China controversy. So I was in Kenya with about 10 PhD students from different countries from Africa, and this was a topic actually we were discussing. And I asked them, how many of you are for China and how many of you are for the West? And 9 out of 10 said China. And there is one student from Uganda saying, no, you don't understand. And then she brought 10 lists of China's myths in Africa, and she distributed that to the students. And the students read that, and no, still we are for Africa. So the reason they gave wider support to China over the Western countries is because they say we see something in the continent, on the ground. We see hospitals, we see roads. But China is exploiting all the resources, but still we support China because at least we see some movement. But even from Chinese perspective, they're not trying to hide anything. China said we are in Africa for business. They're not trying to say, okay, we are trying to develop your country, we are here to democratize your country. They say, no, we are here for business. You take it or leave it. It's up to you. As the earlier speaker was saying, it's up to us. It's African countries' agency, how to take it or not, how to approach it, how to negotiate. It's up to African countries. And in fact, one specific item on their development aid to any country in Africa, for that matter, any part of the world, is if you want to get a loan from us, if you want any aid from us, 50% of that money you have to spend on products from China. That was not obvious from aid from other Western countries, but China said, this is what I have, this is what you have to purchase, and I will build, you have to give me this. And I'm not trying to put any conditions on you for democratization, human rights. And those students, when I ask them, there is human rights issues, there is exploitation issue that China is bringing here. What are the other options do we have? The other countries in the West, they gave us these resources, but still we don't have democracy in the continent. So okay. we have to take, I don't know if I go too far into neo-colonization. I don't know if I go 100% into free trade, because as a trade economy, there is no free trade in the world. So somewhere in between.
Okay, I'll give one more person the opportunity. Go ahead, Kwamina, and then we have to close.
I'm not that old, but we used to have this idea of international aid at jobs for the boys. My personal regret is I wish we had a lot of time to dig up the history of trade, citing the Colonial Secretary of State. And I do this not because I want to bash somebody or make somebody responsible for my life, but I also like to bear the history. Like, for example, before Ofebuanye passed away in the Ivory Coast, setting aside 1 million metric tons of cocoa beans. Because when Kwame Nkrumah was trying to save cocoa beans, Ofebuanye thought he could rely on the French, and he ended up banning 1 million metric tons of cocoa beans. Getting back to the Chinese, I like to, instead of talking about whether they are good or bad, or whether they do 50%, or whether they do jobs for their boys and girls, the Chinese come with a different approach. Oh, by the way, Millennium Challenge account, for those of you who go to Ghana, Millennium Challenge account money was used under George Bush number 43 to build one of the nicest highways in Ghana. It was American money that went to the Chinese. It's because the Chinese are low-cost producers. That's why the contract went to them. It's interesting, I ran into somebody who said, I drove on the road and it was full of hills. I brought a picture. This is a sports stadium the Chinese built. I went inside looking for cracks. This was used for the Africa Cup in 2007 or 2008. I didn't find a crack in the entire building. The bad news is the building is in a waterlogged area. That is the fault of the Ghanaians.
Exactly.
The approach to the Chinese is, instead of giving you the funds or instead of ordering parts from Japan, whatever it is, they build it for you. So you need quantity surveyors. People who know this microphone is equal to one bag of cocoa beans. That is how the Africans have to deal with the Chinese.
Thank you. All right. Great closing remarks. We have many more questions, but we are out of time. But I do want to do one thing. In the first panel, Dr. Igwe intervened in his African way and, gave us a question. So this time I want to invite just one question from the audience. If you have a question, ask Jason to, I see the hand up over there. Jason, can you give her the mic, and we'll take that last question from the audience.
Nancy Reardon. I'm in the Global Governance Human Security PhD program here, and I'm studying global space governance. And recently the African Union are trying to form a regional space organization for Africa. I'd like to ask the panel, since this is very important to the economy, do you think it's possible for Africa to form a regional space organization, and if not, why?
Africa, a regional space organization.
My answer to that question is, I gave a talk at Cape Coast University when they were launching their Oil and Gas Institute, and I threw out the gauntlet by challenging anybody who said Africans could not do the things I said we could do. And I said that if you look at space, if you look at the drones that were being used, deployed by the US, you would find Ghanaians and other Africans involved. Immediately after my presentation, it was announced in the hall like this that the next speaker scheduled is a young Ghanaian scientist. Those of you who are young, Google him. He's called the Rocket Man. That was before the North Korean man was called the Rocket Man by Donald Trump. So we have the capability. It's a question of priorities.
Patricia.
I think, yeah, I would say categorically African can have such a regional grouping, and it's also relevant and important. However, it's leadership and political will. If I'm not optimistic before I am now, given that, especially, for instance, what Kagame has done with UN, AU, African Union as president, he has been able to do something that has not been done since African Union was established in 2001, and that is try to get some countries to contribute in terms of financing African Union. It's still very low now, but that's a progress that he made. Nobody could make. And also, I don't know if it's the same thing with, is it African Continental Free Trade Agreement? Yeah, yes. As of today, 52 countries have signed. Yep. They are waiting for Nigeria.
I know.
So I think it's possible, in as much as we are all critical of what is going on in the continent. If you look at the continent on individual countries, we see some progress, some places. But we also understand that a region like EU, which is the template that most of these regional organizations use, did not start yesterday. They started like more than 60, 70 years ago. So African as a region, as a country, or whether it's AU regional organizations are still very new and very young. And there is hope that something is going to happen. And yes, I believe that it is possible.
Thank you. Joe?
My view is, that it's a laudable, initiative, but I'll be more interested in what the objectives are and what the end goals are. Are we trying to launch our own satellites so that we can have a satellite orbiting our continent and improve the communication technology and infrastructure, or are we duplicating what NASA and other existing satellites are doing, or are we trying to also show that Africans can go to space? Because Africans can go to space, we know that because we have scientists all over the world who have been able to demonstrate that. So I would rather be more interested in the outputs of search and exploration and the extent to which it will benefit the infrastructural system that space science is able to offer. I mean, for the current countries and regions where we have scientists already currently in space. But if we don't think about that in a very critical form, then we end up duplicating and just trying to develop technologies that already exist, and that does not really move us any further. For example, Indians, Kwame Nkrumah during his time set up the Atomic Energy Commission in Ghana. And so at the time in the 60s, Ghanaians had atomic energy expertise. And we still have atomic energy in Ghana up to now. That is part of one of the things that the West were concerned as part of its overthrow, etc. But if you go to India at the moment, they have nuclear and also space exploration. But then there's so many poor people in India. India has one of the highest poor population in the world. If you go to Pakistan, they are racing into the space and who have the most efficient nuclear technology as a way of threatening each other, whereas their citizens go poor. So I wouldn't want us to be racing to space when we are not tackling the situation. Yeah, so that...
Ghana is trying to. Good for it.
So that brings me to the first point, that if we're going to do this as a way of enhancing our current infrastructure and developmental being, as a international development person, I would say that's a very laudable achievement. And we should be able to figure out those aspects that we need to develop this technology in the sense of using space technology to enhance our development locally, infrastructure, and also maybe employment, so as to enhance our developments so that we don't have to solicit that from elsewhere. But if we don't get that done properly and set it out properly, then it becomes another institution that does not really move us forward.
Okay.
That is be my concern.
Nancy's question has provoked some tensions, I think, on the panel.
We can talk about this further, yes.
Go ahead, last word, and then we have to invite our students up to give their own presentations. Go ahead.
I think I left my audience hanging in terms of where I'm headed with.
Well, they are a fantastic audience. Yes.
With what I intended to do. If you pick natural resources, for example, we need to do at the very minimum 3 or 4 things. One, as a start, can we go back and renegotiate all those agreements that we've had to increase our royalties and whatever incomes that we take in? And as a concrete situation, Ghana started producing oil commercially December 15, 2010. As at now, it has earned 0 in corporate taxes. How do I know this? I write Ghana's oil reports. I sit here in Boston and I write them, so this is not book long. I'm not copying somebody, cutting and pasting or anything like that. This is straight from the horse. Second, we need to do value addition. If you go to the Cocoa Research Institute, there's a place there where they take cocoa beans and make all kinds of fancy things with it. Third, we need to develop science, technology, engineering, and math and application. Maybe that's where your space thing will play a role. And then fourthly, we should seriously think about going more scientific than being fatalistic, making sure that what we do with our oil and gas, petrol and cocoa, we extend it to cocoyam and things that we can put in our empty stomachs. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, panelists. These esteemed panelists, thank you so much. Excellent job, all of you. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you.